Margaret Cain giving a history of Unity in Springfield. This is July of 1987. This is about myself as well. I shall be giving dates and events from memory. Some could be verified by the scrapbook which I kept and is now at the Unity Church at 417 Cordelia Street. Also, some dates could be verified or changed by Dr. Richard Taylor, Director of Research and Publication of the Historical Sites for the state of Illinois at this time. He did considerable research on the subject of New Thought and Unity in connection with the Susan Lawrence home now owned by the state. He wrote an article, and I have a copy of it, and I shall probably leave it in the hands of Karen Kelly for safekeeping. There is a history of Unity in Springfield, given about 1943 or 44, which is in the scrapbook at Unity Church. The first truth meetings were held in the Susan Lawrence mansion in the 1920s. However, Mrs. Lawrence had all types of metaphysical books for sale and for study. I knew Mrs. Phyllis C. Snyder, now deceased, who attended meetings there, and also her daughter Ernestine went to Sunday school at the Lawrence home, and she lives now in Springfield. I did not attend classes at the Susan Lawrence home. There were guest speakers from out of town. Dr. David Bush in 1921 spoke on Applied Psychology and Scientific Living. One of the earliest local teachers was a man by the name of Frank Waller Allen, a journalist and later ordained as a minister. He was the pastor of First Christian Church at 6th and Cook from 1914 to 1917. He held classes there in the church in his new philosophy. The Reverend Mr. Allen stayed in Springfield for 7 more years after he resigned from the ministry. He published several short stories and wrote a column for the Illinois State Journal. He became a popular lecturer and New Thought person, and usually sponsored by the Springfield College of Music and Allied Arts, located on 2nd Street, maybe in the 600 block. I knew Clarence Mayer slightly. He ran that college. I did not know or remember seeing the Reverend Mr. Allen. I did know his wife, and she gave me books because she was the daughter of Mrs. Meek. But some way, Susan Lawrence and the Allens became acquainted. Now, when Mr. Allen left Springfield, his mother-in-law took over the work. She was not a minister or a licensed teacher exactly. They didn't have any such title in those days. However, Mrs. Meek was my first Unity teacher, and she certainly did know the Unity teaching. She was a teacher and a principal in the Springfield Public Schools. About 1927, Mrs. Lawrence moved the group to the 2nd floor of the building which she owned at 6th and Monroe. All this time she financed the project. Still later, the group left the 6th Street address and moved to the 2nd floor of the Mine Workers Building at Monroe and 4th. It is now called the St. George Building, I believe. The group was on its own financially now. The first Sunday meeting I ever attended of Unity was in this Mine Workers Building. There were few people, maybe 6 or 8. There was a Mr. Eugene Bradley at the piano. Mrs. Meek gave the lesson. It wasn't too long after that, though, that we moved to the Elks Club, where we had the use of a large room on the 2nd floor for Sunday services. Also, Mrs. Meek had a smaller room for daytime classes, an office, and a library. This was about 1930. And listen to this. It was in the Elks Club that the group was first identified as Unity. Mrs. Meek brought in several guest speakers, not all what we would call Unity. Genevieve Barron came. She was a student of Judge Trord in England. A man by the name of Mr. Hollenbeck came. A lady by the name of Thelma Holder. All of them inspired me. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Fillmore visited Springfield in the 1930s. I think it was 1937, under the auspices of this new Unity Center. The meeting was held in the auditorium of the Centennial Building. I attended the meeting. Mr. Fillmore talked on the subject of prosperity. The program is in the scrapbook at Unity Church now. I saved it. The auditorium was not filled, of course, but the crowd wasn't too bad at all, considering that this was a great many years ago. Mrs. Susan Lawrence was in the congregation at the Elks Club. I remember her in her fancy hats and fashionable clothes. She sent me a Christmas card, which is in the scrapbook at the church. She was thanking me for what I did to help Mrs. Meek, and I don't know that I did anything. Susan invited me to visit her in the big house, which I regret to say I didn't accept at that time, with 2 small children. Later she moved to the smaller house across the railroad, which she already owned. Well, Unity kept on at the Elks Club with fair attendance until about 1940. Mrs. Meek then had classes in her home at the brick apartments at the corner of 4th and Cook Streets. She died on December the 7th, 1941. The group had run down somewhat. Mrs. Meek was buried on Susan Lawrence's lot at Oak Ridge. I was able to give Mr. Taylor this particular bit of information. Now, 4 of us stood around the grave afterward asking, shall we try to go on with Unity, or should we let it go here in Springfield? And the 4 around the grave were Bernice Biggers, who later became a Unity minister, Alice Stubbles, who took care of the literature, and such a fine lady, Howard Heaton, Heaton, the father of Helene Tooley, who attends Unity Church in Springfield now, and myself. That was the 4 of us. All are deceased except myself. We decided to meet the next Sunday. Mr. Heaton was acquainted with Mrs. Kellogg, the Unity minister in Decatur at that time. He said he would ask her to come to Springfield the next Sunday morning. She did this for several months. Also, she came all day on Thursdays for classes. Mrs. Kellogg had a licensed teacher in Decatur who did the Sunday services for a while. In the 1940s, Maud Kellogg asked me to be her secretary in the daytime here in Springfield. I quit my office job, and she paid me $20 a week. I had been getting $35 a week. Mrs. Kellogg moved us out of the Elks Club into a store front next to the tavern at 4th and Adams. It was about where the bakery is now. It was cleaned and made inviting, and we bought some wicker straight chairs at Dirkson's for $2 or $2.50 each, and we had a platform and a piano and a book section, and there was a balcony toward the back which was made into a lounge or reading room. It was really quite cozy, and I think it was in that location that Catherine Van Meter taught a metaphysical Bible interpretation class on Sunday morning. Mrs. Van Meter has recently moved back to Springfield. Well, in this location we were to pay $75 a month, and it seemed so much, but we were on our own now with God. It was in this place that Etta Yost first walked in the door, and I'm sure I was in attendance as Mrs. Kellogg's secretary. Etta was working at the war plant in Illiopolis, and she stopped in on her way from work. She was dressed in slacks, which were not fashionable for ladies in those days, and Blanche Gray came in that location also. But back to being Mrs. Kellogg's secretary, I asked her one day why she chose me. There were others who wanted the job, and she said Spirit told her. And she was instrumental in me going into the Unity work. She paid my expenses and took me to Unity Village the first time. She knew I would want to go there to study, which I did the next summer. About this time, some Verdon people asked Mrs. Kellogg for someone to have Unity classes in their village, and so she sent me. We had quite a nice group there for 2 or 3 years. Mrs. Kellogg also sent me to Jacksonville, where we had classes at the Dunlap Hotel. And all of this time, I was writing correspondence lessons, leading to becoming a licensed Unity teacher. I don't remember exactly when or why we left the bakery location on Adams Street. I suspect we had to give it up. For a time, we were quite homeless and had meetings in various places, including the old state capitol building long before it was restored in 1966. And they would let us have a lodge room in the midst of the offices in the courthouse. And I remember one time Dr. Dale, the registrar from Unity School, was here as a guest speaker, and we had him to speak in the courthouse. He was a very large man and very vehement, and I feel I owe a great deal to him in my study of affirmations. But this time, in his enthusiasm, he knocked the small box podium off of the table onto the floor. It wasn't a very substantial arrangement anyway. Once or twice we had meetings in the Masonic Temple, also in homes, any place which was available. Well, some way we ended up in another storefront later on Adams Street, closer to the First National Bank. 414, I believe, was the number. It was at one time a children's clothing shop. Mrs. Eva Conover, who had been Mrs. Kellogg's secretary in Decatur, was by now a licensed teacher and ordained as a minister. She was ahead of me. Mrs. Conover, as our minister, took us into this new storefront, and it was fixed up very nicely also. But in about 1946, Mrs. Kellogg, Mrs. Conover, I should say, led us from the storefront to the purchase of the property at 709 South 7th Street. My, this was a huge step for us. This was to be our permanent Unity home. Where we got the money for the down payment, I can't recall. No doubt it was from God. It wasn't a large amount. The building was sold to us for $18,000. We had a board of directors by now, and we had bylaws. We were able to get a loan from the First Federal Savings and Loan, which was a blessing then, and a blessing when we needed a loan for 417 Cordelia, and still another time when we purchased the small house on the corner of Cordelia and 5th. But back to the subject of 709 South 7th Street. We fixed a platform and took our wicker chairs to the new location. Different gifts of furniture were placed in the building. Mrs. Conover and her mother, Mrs. Cora Metham, lived upstairs at 709 South 7th. The chapel was L-shaped. There were sort of two parts to it. There were lovely built-in bookcases for books, imported stained glass windows, and lovely narrow wood floors. Our place was dedicated by the Reverend L.E. Meyer from Unity Village. We had a choir of which Helene Tooley and I were members, and I think Mrs. Crump also. Well, Mrs. Conover was our leader and minister in Springfield for about 10 years. In the meantime, in 1948 or 49, I traveled to Gary, Indiana as a licensed teacher to give Sunday evening services there. You see, I needed to run a center in order to be ordained in those days. I held classes in Hammond, Indiana also, and I went back and forth to Gary and Hammond from Springfield, my home base. I went on Sunday and returned home Tuesday night. I did this for 3 or 4 years. The person who followed me in Gary and Hammond established a fine church there. I was really ordained, seemingly from Gary, because that was where I was doing my practice work. The word center was used more frequently than church in those days. About 1951, I was guided to leave Gary and Hammond and become minister in Bloomington, Illinois. Mrs. Hazel Arisman, minister in Decatur, had established a storefront center in Bloomington, and she wanted to give all of her efforts to Decatur. So I traveled back and forth from Springfield to Bloomington 3 or 4 times a week, and we had a good center there. It was in this location that I first met Mr. and Mrs. Harold Simpson and their daughter, who was a tiny girl then. They all now attend the Springfield Church at 417 Cordelia. I left the Bloomington group in 1956. I was crying when I left. I had been asked to become a minister in Springfield, Illinois, my home. Eva Conover had decided to become the minister in Peoria, and many people came up the steps of 709 South 7th Street to learn the truth while I was minister. I think I'll give a few names. I hesitate to do this for fear I don't remember all, but I'll try, and if I leave anybody out, I ask forgiveness. The Colburns came, and the Grays, and the Briggs family. Alan Preble was present often. Evelyn Pascal came. Dr. Moore and his wife Mildred. Walter Myers and his wife Violet. Andy and June Colas were there. Mary Springer came. Claudine Mander and her twin daughters were present. Gladys Jacobus was there, and she fixed such beautiful flowers for us. Ruth Alteg was often in attendance to play the piano. Elizabeth Stewart came, Iris Jones, Betty Long. I was thrilled when Betty came. Joanne Butler, Marie Corey, the Jansons, the Franz Rebs, the Heels, the Corcocks, all were there. And Mrs. Val Watt and Son, Mr. Hershey later on. And Dr. Doyle came from Jacksonville. And I remember he said one time he walked up the steps with his young family and he thought to himself, what am I doing going into a house instead of a church? But he's still coming to Unity, and I'm grateful. Toward the end of the time at 709 South 7th Street, Carol Scott and Pat Meter came in one Wednesday night to service. I shall never forget it. And Karen Kelly heard her first Unity message in Springfield when she came to 709 South 7 with Karen Bish. Was Karen Kelly surprised to see me standing there instead of a priest. Walter Myers was president of the board for 6 years on 7th Street, and then Dr. Moore became president toward the end of our time there, and was president when we built the new church, altogether serving for 6 years. We had some very famous speakers in this location at 709 South 7th. Among them was Dr. Marcus Bach. I worked for 2 years to get him here. At night we took him to the municipal building to accommodate a larger crowd. For the morning service we had the whole first floor of 709 South 7th wired for sound. People were all over the place. They could hear, but they couldn't see. James D. Freeman spoke. Dr. George Lamsa, the Bible scholar from the land of Jesus, spoke in Springfield in about early 1960s. What an event this was. I remember that Jack Walgamot sang for the Dr. Lamsa service that Sunday. I could even tell you what he sang. I walked today where Jesus walked. I asked him recently if he still had the Lamsa Bible he bought that day, and he said indeed he did. Ralph Ray came to speak, Ed Hoagie and Warren Myers and others. We always had a banquet every spring, and I would get Unity ministers to come and speak. It was usually held at Lincoln Park Pavilion, and we would have special music. Sometimes it was Jack Walgamot and his barbershop quartet. Once it was a Lanphier choir, and sometimes Dan Spreckelmeyer and his high school group. But quite a crowd attended this annual banquet from all over central Illinois, Decatur, Peoria, Bloomington, Jacksonville, and all around. It would be a big occasion. At 709 South 7th, Ethel Spengler played the piano for church services at the beginning of my term. And then she passed on, and Joe Volk played, and Wendell Kennedy played a time or two. We were given an organ about this time, and Evelyn Vaughn came along and stayed 18 years, I believe it was. It was in this building that the Dial of Prayer was started, as it has continued for many years. I was always proud of the prayer for the day and the fact that we were on the radio, and that I was always so thankful that we could buy the little house on the corner of 5th and Cordelia. But back to 709 7th Street. All this time we were paying off the mortgage and finding the heat bills very, very high. And the upkeep was huge, and the building had to be painted every 2 or 3 years. It didn't seem large enough for the people coming anymore. And we were allowed at that time to use the parking lot of the townhouse across the street on Sunday morning. I mentioned a while ago that we had a sound system. We also had air conditioning on the first floor. And in those days, there would be 2 or 3 couples who would come from the First Methodist Church downtown. They would come because we had air conditioning, and the First Church didn't. And this might be interesting to some of you. Dr. Ray Grumman occupied my pulpit one time at 709 South 7th. He was a retired Methodist minister, and I had known him a long time. Well, we began to think about selling the building and getting or buying a new church. And we sold the building at 709 South 7th for $57,000, which was a nice nest egg for 14 years ago, or 15, whatever it is. We looked and looked for lots, but they were so expensive. And we looked at churches and buildings for sale. Roger Heald was a builder and in our midst. We began to think in terms of a metal building. The lot at 417 Cordelia was advertised in the newspaper one Sunday in July. Mr. and Mrs. Colburn first saw it and told the board. We went out on a Sunday afternoon to look at the ground. There was a tiny hut on the back of the lot. There was a huge tree in the front where the parking lot is now. But that very afternoon, the board decided to buy the ground. It was only $8,000. And Dr. Moore and I went to the realtor that Sunday afternoon. I could write checks, so we put some money down. The next day, attorney Harold Werner met with us and the realtor, and the deal was closed. From that day on, I think Dr. Moore was at the site every day. We did not ask for money. We did not issue any bonds. We had some more dollars besides the $50-some thousand, and a lady had remembered us with a gift in her will of $16,000. We saved all of that except $1,000, which we paid for the new piano in the chapel. The church at 417 Cordelia was designed by Roger Heel, who knew our needs and how much money we had. I was determined not to have a huge debt on our hands. I believe the cement slab was down by early August of 1972. We had our first service in the building the first Sunday in December of 1972. My, we had a huge crowd. Representatives of all of the companies who worked on the building were present. And we brought along just the furniture we had. We didn't get anything new at first at all. We used those folding metal chairs which had replaced the uncomfortable wicker chairs. Steve Davis sang at the first service in the new building, and he sang, "Put your hand in the hand of the man from Galilee." 6 months later, the building was dedicated by the Reverend Robert Sicking as a representative of Unity School and the Association of Unity Churches. He was very appreciative of the metal building. He said he didn't think there was another like it in the United States. We were in the new church a year or two and began to think of new chairs for the chapel. Pews and theater seats were investigated and seemed out of the question. And we got a sample of the orange-colored chairs now in use and had one on Sunday morning for the people to see. And about $4,000 came forth that summer to pay for them. Some people paid for 2 and some for 4, according to the size of the family. I think it was Iris who said she would pay for 2 because she wanted her mother to have a seat when she came to church. Her mother came along with her quite often. It was like a miracle the way the money came in, and the chairs added color to the chapel. And the candles, lights on the pulpit are in memory of Dr. M.W. Moore, who was president of the board. He did so much, and his wife and his sister and others gave money in his memory. The pulpit or podium I bought as a gift when we were at 709 South 7th Street. The antique chairs on the pulpit, on the platform, Mr. Heaton and I bought at an antique shop years and years ago. The wood was black until we finished, and of course they had to be reupholstered. The wings above the platform I got at Unity Village one summer. I was attending a conference at the village, and they announced that 2 handmade Unity wings were for sale, and I knew I had to get one, but I didn't have enough money, but they said they would trust me. The present organ is the second one. This one was dedicated to me 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, much to my surprise and joy and delight. In 1978, I was guided to retire, and Linda Spencer came to be our minister. I feel that she has done a very fine job. She was a divine selection, and I'm grateful for her love and her light and her life. I feel that the divine plan is being unfolded in divine order, and I'm so grateful to God for the Unity teaching in Springfield. I'm sure you are too. Thank you so much for listening to me. This is Margaret Cain giving the history of Unity in Springfield, Illinois, and this is July of 1987. God bless.